Hello, my name is Anwar. I'm a designer, a developer, and a teacher at Treehouse, coming to you for my first ever live stream, live from Portland, Oregon. I thank everyone for joining me today. I hope everyone out there is healthy and safe. The topic for my initial series of live streams is going to be responsive CSS layouts. We're going to start really simple, unstyled HTML page. Just make it legible across a variety of viewports using as little CSS as possible. In future weeks, we're going to get a little bit more advanced, multi-column layouts, drop in some media, talk about responsive images, that type of thing. A reminder that there's more lessons, videos, all kinds of resources at teamtreehouse.com. We offer courses in UX, front-end web development. I teach in both of those, as well as full-stack JavaScript, Python, PHP, lots of exciting stuff. An additional reminder that this chat is moderated. If you have questions for me about Treehouse in general or anything specific I'm accomplishing here, things you'd like to see in future lessons that I can prep for you, don't hesitate to let us know. In terms of what will you need to get started today besides, well, browser, internet connection, stuff like that. Your favorite code editor or IDE, Atom, Sublime Text, wherever you're comfortable. I like Visual Studio Code, but you don't have to be in that. Also, you're going to need some starter files. I have them loaded up here. The address is github.com/Anwar Montasir. I believe our moderator is pasting the link in, so that's probably easiest. But that's ANWAR/MONTASIR/RCL, and you can clone or download the files to get started. All right, in terms of what do we have as a starter, what are we building? Well, taking a look at the starter, you can see not too visually glamorous because it doesn't have any CSS yet. I just have some plain old HTML, some links in the nav that don't go anywhere. We might build a more interesting responsive navigation down the road. Some links, one to myself in LinkedIn, if you would like to connect with me, I'd enjoy that. A link to Treehouse, and then some resources, a little history on responsive design, a CSS reset, and a system font stack. We'll plug those in pretty early as we go. Also a resource on fluid typography, which will probably be the last thing we handle today. One thing I want to call attention to, now there's no images, video, any sort of media. We'll get there, though not today. And obviously adding those takes a little bit more thinking. Responsive images is actually, I love talking about it. It's quite a in-depth topic. But anyway, minus any of that media, I wanted to point out that this page is actually already responsive, right? An unstyled page, well, there you go. My body copy actually adjusts its flow based on the width of the viewport. Now, this is not a good-looking page, right? It's Times New Roman, the font is tiny, and as I make my page wide, the text is super wide. You wouldn't want to give people text to read that's this wide. But the reason I point out the fact that web body copy is inherently responsive is just beginning students that I've worked with sometimes, they feel understandably daunted by building a responsive page. And they think to themselves, should I plug in a grid framework? Do I need something like Bootstrap to make it happen? Do I need to jump into CSS Grid right away? I've heard a lot about CSS Grid. Well, grid frameworks can be cool if they're the right approach for a particular project. CSS Grid is awesome, and we'll cover it in a future lesson, although it can be a bit daunting if you're just getting started, and you really want to think about why are we using it. Today, like I said, my goal is as little CSS as possible to make a page that looks something like this. We have a responsive navigation up top. It's horizontal as long as the viewport allows. At some point, we reach a breakpoint, and it switches to be vertical because there's no longer the space to have a horizontal navigation. Yeah, and otherwise I've styled the text for greater legibility. Got a footer down there. And I mentioned fluid typography. This is a really nice feature, CSS only. We're not plugging in any JavaScript today. And my text is just going to grow larger as my viewport does. Pardon me 1 second, making sure I have the chat window open. Okay, taking a look at VS Code then, what's in the starter files that I gave you? Well, ta-da, there's style.css, and you can see a super helpful comment that lets you know that this is a file called style.css. I have it in a subfolder called CSS, whatever flow makes sense for your project is fine. I have index.html. My focus here has been, let me turn word wrap on, thought I did that already. My focus here has been purely semantic markup so far. There's no references to CSS whatsoever in my HTML. How did I make this page? Well, just as a quick overview, those of you who are VS Code users, you might be familiar with the fact you don't need to make a new page like I am right now, but if you have a page saved with a .html extension, exclamation mark, tab, cool, we get a really nice starter template. Doc type, we know this is an HTML5 document. The HTML language attribute, so my screen reader knows how to pronounce this thing, assuming we're going to use English body copy, of course. My head with the meta character set declarations, so I can type special characters like a copyright symbol or curled quotes or whatever, and they'll work out fine. Viewport declaration, very important. We are building a responsive page. A title, nothing in the body. Okay, gonna trash this file. That, like I said, was just to demonstrate that. I've added a little bit more to my head. Meta description, I did that by habit. I'm honestly not concerned in the slightest that search engine optimization, that search engines be able to find this demo, but by habit, I like to provide a description. Changed up my title so it didn't just say document or whatever the default is. I have the link to my style sheet. Semantic markup, I gave my page a header, main, and footer. The footer, very simple. I did a copyright symbol. I did plug in a tiny bit of JavaScript there. This is just to show you the idea that, I write a lot of JavaScript, but I'm always looking new things up, right? A thinking might be, well, I could just write copyright 2020, but the year changes and I need to maintain that. So I just went and Googled it, found it at Stack Overflow, JavaScript, current year. And there we go, document.write, write it to my document, the new date object, and then get full year. There we go. That gives me 2020, since that's what year it is. That's all the JavaScript I'm going to be talking about today. My header has a navigation, the nav element, a bulleted list, a couple of links that don't go anywhere. My main, that's a pretty important element in terms of semantic HTML, letting screen readers know. This is where the main content starts on my page. Kind of an unusual HTML5 semantic element in that you can only use one per page. I'm imagining this as an article with sections. I've used a semantic heading structure. H1 names my article, responsive CSS layouts, and then descending order in terms of hierarchy of content. Here are some H2s. What will we be learning? What is responsive web design? And then, yeah, a couple of H3s. This particular section has some subsections, so I went down once in hierarchy. Okay. Otherwise, yeah, there we go. No classes or IDs because, well, like I said, no references so far to the CSS. All right. In terms of getting started with my CSS, let's check out those two resources I gave you. One was a CSS reset. Now, not everyone works with one of these, and I'm not here to tell you that do everything my way. There's a couple of valid approaches to get going on a brand new page. But I like a CSS reset for a couple reasons. One, you might be familiar with the idea that inconsistency between browsers. You take an H1 element, oh, how much padding or margin is around an H1? How big is this H1 by default? I don't know the answers, but it might be inconsistent from browser to browser. A reset and a normalize are typically two ways to give you consistency between browsers. A normalize is a developer's solid idea of what some good defaults might be. I like a reset better. A reset shrinks everything down, no margin, no padding, no border. There we go. Box model is completely resized. Font size is 100%. And the reason why I like that is when I'm building a page and I get in there and I'm inspecting this element, my p tag or whatever, and I'm noticing, there's 10 pixels of padding on the left. How did that get there? Well, if I'm working with the browser defaults or normalize, then maybe that's coming from the defaults. If I'm working from a reset, though, and I set everything back to 0, I'm pretty confident that if there's 10 pixels on the left, I must have put it there. So that's my philosophy anyway. I'm also using a CDN, Content Delivery Network, version of the file. In other words, if you're using a common file, let's say the jQuery library or Google Fonts, or in this case, my reset, really common file, I would rather go get it from a common location, such as CDN, Content Delivery Network, JS. That increases the chance that the user already has this file cached. And again, as long as we're talking about responsive layouts, we want to talk about, lost my train of thought. We want to talk about keeping file sizes loaded. I just had a question in the chat about what software am I using. Really just a web browser. I happen to have Firefox open. If you're in Chrome, that's fine. And I'm going to use VS Code, but if you have a preferred editor, Atom, Sublime Text, you name it, totally fine. All right, so I will copy this reset. You will also notice I want to grab the minified version. There we go. My CSS looks very tiny, one small sentence, but hey, that'll load faster than this version, which is nice and easy to read, but I'm not going to make any changes with it. I'm just going to implement it. So here we go. First actual change I've made. This is going to be above my style.css. Don't forget CSS executes from the top down. So if you put your style sheet first, then reset.css, you potentially end up resetting a lot of your own styles, which is no good. The relationship is style sheet, the href equals, and there is the link that I got it from on the web. Okay. Try that out in my browser. It's one small change, but hey, there we go. All my font sizes are back down to 100%. My headings aren't bold anymore. No padding, no margin, no border. Obviously, we need to go fix that up now, but hey, that's a good start. In terms of another resource I gave you, by the way, I gave you 2 more, and the third one we're going to hold off on for now. System font stacks. Right now, my font is Times New Roman. Obviously, if I were trying to reflect somebody's brand, you know, oh, hey, we use Avenir here at this company. Well, all right, then I would go with the font that matches the brand. I don't have that in this situation, and what I'd like to show you, if I click this, CSS Tricks, excellent resource for all things CSS, basically pick the system font. What font will that be? Depends on the system. So in my case, I am running a very recent version of Mac OS X, so the built-in font would be San Francisco. Great. Use San Francisco. We're going to get fast performance because the machine, I should say, doesn't have to slow down to load this font. You also get familiarity. Users on a Mac are going to go, oh, well, San Francisco. Even if it's unconscious, they will recognize that font. On an Android, it's going to give you Roboto. On Windows Vista, it's apparently going to give you Sego UI, if I'm even saying that right. But anyway, default to a font that users, it'll load quickly. Users are comfortable with it. Okay. I'm going to grab the one Medium and WordPress apparently use. Copy that. Paste that into my style sheet. I can lose the comment that says that this is called style.css. And there we go. I'm actually going to, before I test this out in the browser, make one other common change a lot of you might be familiar with. The asterisk, the universal selector, I try not to use this universal selector for almost anything because of performance issues, but some of you are probably aware of box sizing, border box, and the idea is just make my box model behave a little bit more predictably, include padding in my calculations. I don't think that's actually going to affect anything that I do today in particular. When we get to more advanced multi-column layouts, that might have more of an effect. I had a question in the forum about, do I work on JavaScript? Do I? Yes. Will we need any today? No. If you all have suggestions for future lessons, I might plug some in. But other than the get the current year, that's the only JavaScript I've used so far. Today will be purely a CSS lesson. All right, testing this out. And the box sizing border box, we didn't really see a visible change. That's just affecting how my browser makes box model calculations. My font now should be San Francisco because I'm on Mac OS X. If I were to launch this and try it on an Android device, I would see Roboto. Okay, continuing from there, I need to actually start styling this font, right? We're going to need some spacing. We're certainly going to need some different font sizes, things like that. In terms of my font size, I'm just going to, well, let's see. I'm going to come back to that, actually. Let me work on some of my spacing first. H1, H2, H3, I know I have some headings. I can use the comma to impact all three elements. I'm going to make the font be bold. You'll recall that my reset made all my fonts normal. Add some margin to the bottom. I'm going to use one rem. I'm not going to cover ems versus rems today. They're both relative to the original font size. They just work with inheritance a little different. If there are questions about that, I can illustrate that in another lesson. But yeah, 1 times the original font size of margin down at the bottom. Line height. Now, these are headings. My headings on mobile will likely wrap onto multiple lines. But unlike paragraphs, I don't want to give these a ton of space in between lines. I don't want it to say, you are reading the first headline. All right, well, that looks really disjointed on a mobile device. So paragraphs, I want to give them a comfortable amount of space underneath each line. Headings, I really don't, so I'm just going to go with 1.1. Line height, why is it the one unitless measurement? The explanation is a little bit obscure. Unit-less line height. All right. A number of, here we go. Recommended due to the fact that child elements will inherit the raw number value, etc. If you want to dig further in that, I'm just going to paste that in here. But that's the recommendation. Okay. Do you prefer to make everything fluid, or are you just using a few common breakpoints? Probably a mixture. I'm going to start out looking at mobile, and actually, funny enough that I should get that reminder, I'm actually not viewing this in mobile view, and I should, of course. I want to be styling for mobile first to keep my CSS as small as possible for mobile, and then add some breakpoints, what happens as my screen gets larger. So that's a good question. In terms of part 2 of the question, and if you're not familiar with the term breakpoints, we'll cover that in a moment. I actually don't use common breakpoints, meaning you might find that some websites say, oh, at 480 pixels in width, my layout is now transitioning from a mobile layout to a tablet layout. And then at 720 pixels, I'm making this up, it's transitioning from tablet to desktop, right? I don't really believe in fixed numbers like that. I basically style for mobile, then start dragging on my viewport. And once the design breaks, thus the term breakpoint, once my design breaks where I go, at 490 it looked good, at 500 it started looking a little weird, somewhere around there needs to go a breakpoint where I change the look of my design. So it's a really excellent question, whoever asked that. But yeah, I don't use universal breakpoints. I do it design by design. Okay. Let's see. Space out my paragraphs as well, and then we'll see how that looks. As I mentioned, paragraphs, you want much more generous vertical spacing than you would with a heading. I'm also going to make the spacing, I want my headings a little bit closer to the paragraphs. I'm going to put a little bit more generous spacing underneath each paragraph. I will go with 1.5 rem, and again, line height, and that's this link up here. Line height is really the only, you're still basically multiplying the original font size, but this is the only measurement where it's recommended you actually don't specify a unit. And yeah, like I said, the reasoning is a tiny bit obscure, and I've given you a link if you want to dig in more. Okay, cool, some spacing, right? My headings have not grown any larger yet, but we got some spacing here, a little more generous under my paragraphs, and footer looks too large compared to the rest of my text, but we're on our way. How am I doing here? Okay. All right. Some more basics in terms of how should you organize your CSS, by the way. This is the sort of question that, boy, has driven people who develop CSS crazy. My colleague, Gil, who teaches front-end web development and full-stack JavaScript as well, did a lesson, a live stream just the other day on CSS variables, and really I think plugging in variables is going to change a lot how you're going to be able to organize your CSS. There's so many different philosophies on how to organize a CSS, and I'm talking about vanilla CSS, not plugging in Sass or less or something like that. I'm just covering some of the basics up top, then I'll get a little bit more specific lower down. Alrighty. My link colors. 06C. I'm typing off some notes. Don't get the feeling as a developer you have to memorize everything. I certainly don't. You'll memorize certain tags and properties just by doing, but nobody has it all memorized. And I'm picking colors and things off of a sheet of paper because I did this exercise already. Text decoration, none, gets rid of the underlines. And of course, if you're going to do that, be extremely cautious just that you've picked enough color contrast that these are obviously links. I've actually made that mistake before. I had, dark gray text, dark blue links, and got rid of the underlines. Oops, nobody could tell that these were links anymore. So if you get rid of the underline, you're removing an obvious visual cue. Make sure you have some other visual cue that these are links, right? Okay, back at it. Scroll down a little bit here. Okay. All right. let's style our header. You'll notice that I haven't really come back to the question of font size yet, but I also haven't come back to the idea of, oops, I take it back. I haven't come to the question of base font size yet. The reason why I haven't covered my heading font sizes is simply because I skipped over part of my notes. All right. I meant to say the H1. You'll notice sometimes if I only have one single line of CSS in a selector, I won't break it out like that. I'll just type it on a single line, whatever you're comfortable with, really. Font size 2.25 rem. Font size 1.75 rem. Again, just using multiples of the original font size and trying to create a generous enough difference. So, oh, this is obviously the main heading versus this is obviously a subheading. At least that's my hope. This is what I was talking about on mobile. Your headings are fairly likely to break onto multiple lines, and I want to make sure I don't make the space in between lines overly generous, the way body copy should have more generous spacing. Yep, and those are my H3s, my subheads to the what will we be learning section. All right, and yeah, base font size. What do I want my body copy to look like from the beginning? Well, right now it's 16 pixels. That's the thing that I haven't addressed yet, and that's because I want to save that for the end. As my page grows larger, we're going to talk about fluid typography. Okay. Heading, or header, I should say. These are headings. This is my header. My header has some unstyled links in it. I can actually mostly get away with just plain old display block here. I'm going to use Flexbox to handle moving to a larger screen. But like I said, I'm trying to keep this lesson as simple as possible and still meet my goals. I'm leaving a break there just, mentally. I'm kind of moving on to a new section in my CSS. That sort of thing doesn't matter while you're developing. You just do what makes sense to you. As long as your indentation is clean and your code is legible. Give it a background color. And I'm just picking very simple, repeatable hex values. If you want your background to be, dark, khaki or something, go for it. But like I said, I'm just going with simple 3-digit hex values that then repeat. Color FFF, although since I have no logo in this case, there's nothing in the header but links, changing the color didn't matter the way I just did it because there's no plain body copy there, there's only links. Alrighty. Nav ULLI. Occasionally I'll get pretty specific with my selectors. I want to make sure that, I'm only styling the list items that actually happen within my navigation. You could potentially solve this with a class or an ID, something like that. I am going to say, we're going to use borders to separate these. Okay. And doing so, cool. I've separated my 4 elements using a border. There's going to be a border. This is kind of an attention to detail thing. There's going to be a border underneath all 4 of these elements. You can't really tell right now, but that's just an attention to detail thing that I'm not really all that thrilled with. So I'm going to use the nth child selector, nav ULLI. I could say nth child and then pick a number, but I'm just going to use the last child pseudo selector to select just my last link and say border bottom none, which will not make any sort of dramatic effect, but you notice this one, this header one got nudged up a pixel because there's no border down there anymore. I suppose if I were to pick a much more obvious color for my borders. There we go. That's a dramatic illustration. Red border, red border, red border. Nope, nothing. Okay, cool. How about styling the actual buttons themselves? One thing I want to watch out for here is nav ULLIA. I'm going to make the color white. I'm going to align the text to the center. And just from those two changes, you can see, well, the text became white, but it's not aligned to the center. And also, you know, if I hover over here, I realize phones don't have a hover state, but, you know, since I'm using my mouse, I can demonstrate this. You actually have to hover on the button text to activate this, which is not great. This is simply because the tag that I'm styling right now, the A element is set to display inline, which allows you to do things like this, have your text flow within a paragraph. Not really going to be workable for my navigation. I'm going to say display block, and that should make a much more effective vertical navigation. Okay, now these are treated as block level elements that are spanning all the way across. Not only does my text look centered now, but I can actually tap anywhere within these buttons. Speaking of being able to tap anywhere within these buttons, I'm going to inspect this. And I might say, how tall are these buttons? Well, it looks like 16 pixels. That's really not going to work. Mobile devices, if you are noticing that your elements are either spaced too closely together or too small, or a combination of the two, people aren't going to be able to tap them. This is actually listed as an accessibility requirement. It's not for things like links that flow within body copy. Those you handle differently. But for interface elements, you want to give people 44 pixels of space to tap them. So I could either spread these out farther or make them larger. I am going to, and like I said, I did this already, right? Padding, 12 pixels at the top and bottom, none on the sides. And that gets me a lot closer. Whoops. Okay. 16 plus 12 plus 12, we're at 40, and you can see where I've highlighted on the page. It shows me that these are 40 tall, so I'm much closer. I said I was aiming at 44. I'm actually just going to make the font a little bigger. And there we go. You might approach this differently, but just keep that guideline in mind. 44 pixels for tappable interface elements, or some combination of size and generous spacing. You don't want people, you know, back when it was 16 pixels, there was the risk of me tapping 2 or even 3 of these elements at once with my finger. Nobody wants that. All right. Other than some spacing concerns, and of course my footer, we're getting pretty close. I haven't dealt with what happens when I expand my page, but we're almost there. Okay, so in terms of my main, I'm going to sneak an extra little trick in here that I love for responsive design. The simple one is just add some spacing, right? 2 rem 0. All right. Generous spacing at the top and bottom. I don't want responsive CSS layouts touching my header. I want some extra space. Okay. A cool CSS feature that I really like in responsive layouts is hyphens auto. And I'm going to Google that, CSS hyphens, and paste in an article from MDN if you are interested. But basically the idea here is hyphenate long words, and I really think that I've had really good success with this feature, and I think having like really long words just break onto a separate line, it can create some really strange issues with your layout. So you can see the difference that I have to actually refresh the page that I'm on. yeah, this looks weird. My layout is still touching the edges of the browser, but you can see initial now actually wraps onto 2 lines. I happen to really like this feature for responsive layouts. Let's see, checking, nope, Slack went off, but that wasn't for this chat, so I'm okay. Keep the questions coming if you have them, by the way. Oh, am I using media queries? All right, question hit just as I was looking for them. I am. I just haven't gotten to that yet. Basically, I'm finishing mobile first, keeping my mobile CSS as small as possible, adding the media queries where I need them. Good question. All right. Generous spacing as well for my sections. I want to make it kind of visually obvious where one section ends and the next one begins. And as far as the footer goes, change the background color. And add some padding, just like I did with the header. And you'll notice I still haven't really started discussing font sizes. I've been saving that one for the end, along with my media queries. All right, so we're getting much more generous spacing here. I can see, this, we still have to talk about padding around my content, right? Like I don't want my content touching the edge. But vertically, things look pretty okay. I have a nav bar with 44 pixels of height per interface element. I have plenty of spacing underneath my, sections. My heading structure hopefully looks reasonably obvious. Okay. And finally, then, we've reached the question of media queries, right? In other words, this page looks pretty good for mobile with one exception, and that one exception is, no padding around my elements. I'm going to handle that in a moment. We also are going to discover that as my page gets wider, this layout becomes less and less satisfying, right? Like, okay, 320 is about the smallest mobile device you'll ever see. At 320, my columns of text look, reasonably okay. And then at some point, I start thinking, these are some really wide columns of text. And what about this nav? What about these strange buttons that go all the way across? So this is the place where I'm going to need some media queries. I'm also going to want to add probably some sort of container or wrapper element around these to make sure that, my content just doesn't touch the edges. So I haven't manipulated the HTML at all to my memory. In terms of where should I put my wrapper or container element, I'm actually going to create a couple of these, and I'll show you why. If I were to say, let's call it container. Container is just a name. It's not an official part of CSS or anything like that. But I'm going to wrap all my content in something called container and define that in my CSS as one rem of padding on the sides. All right. Hopefully that's a comfortable amount near the edges. We can fool with that if we need to. I can see that by wrapping it, did I save that? Dot container, padding, top right, div, oh, there we go. Cool, error checking, right? Good thing I did that. And again, this totally happens to me all the time. If you watch our treehouse videos, stuff like this gets edited out, but what's the problem I made? Well, I checked the spelling, container. I checked the measurements that I used. I checked class versus ID, and oops, I intended this to be a class. I have a feeling I'm going to want to use it multiple times, but what did I type? ID. Okay. Potentially could have found that using the inspector as well. All right. So that looks a little better, but you can see it's added space here and here around the sides of my footer and my header. Not really in love with that look, so instead I am going to add a couple of these containers. I'm going to be pressing in VS Code. You can do Command and the brackets. That's the right bracket. Select Command bracket. Tab these in. I am going to do the same thing in my main. Oops. Okay. And there's other key commands you can use for auto formatting and that sort of thing. All right, one more time for my footer. All right, so 3 separate containers. They still have the padding on the inside, but the benefit of doing it that way is now my background stretches all the way across the page. These look a little weird, huh? The borders don't go all the way across the page. All right, my footer looks good. My body copy looks good. This, if I inspect that, I can see, yeah, here's my container, and it has that extra padding, which doesn't look all that necessary in my header. So if I say something like header.container, so child selector, I want to say that, within my header, if you see .container, we are going to set the padding to 0. Okay, borders stretch all the way across the page. Cool. Back to the question of breakpoints. There's a couple things that I want to think about here. Number one is going to be my navigation. What is the point where starting at, again, maybe 320, since 320 is, as far as I know, the smallest mobile device you'll ever see. Is my page legible here? Yes. Does my navigation look reasonable? I think so. All right, let's expand that browser, and at some point, this is going to start to look weird. It's really kind of up to you. Like, how wide do you think your page is going to be where, number one, having these giant links stretch across the top of the page might look a little strange? And number two, how wide is wide enough to fit 4 buttons across the top, right? Okay. This is way too wide. Like, there's plenty of space here at 1024, and my buttons look really strange going across. So I'm thinking somewhere in this region. 560. Sure, I'll give that a try. Again, I had the question earlier about do I use common breakpoints? I don't. I use trial and error. I use pick the point where my layout breaks and then try out a breakpoint. Okay. So, oops. I will try 560 pixels, so when my screen is at least as wide as 560 pixels, make a change. If I try it out and I don't like it, cool, tweak that number. I am going to use Flexbox, but in this lesson I'm using like the most minimal amount of Flexbox possible. I'm basically saying when my page reaches 560 pixels, just switch to the default horizontal flex layout, like this. Nav UL, display flex. And, well, still some more work to do. But they are going horizontally now. And let's see, what else? Nav UL LI, we are going to do 25%, 4 links, 4 out of 100, 25. Align the text to the center. Well, no, the text should already be centered, right? I don't need to do that. Okay, cool. And they are spaced out. The borders, by the way, are going to get a little curious here. Like, you can see, all right, breakpoint. I'm expanding my page, and at some point I hit that 560, and cool, now it's horizontal, right? If you decide, oh, 560, that was too soon, cool, change your breakpoint. How about 580? All right, now at 568, it's still a vertical navigation, and then you hit 580, expands across the screen. Borders, my border color is really subtle, as we saw earlier. How about bright red? Okay, here's a really strange border. Bottom border, bottom border, bottom border, none. Well, remember, that was a good look for mobile. Not a good color, but it was a good look for the separators. And actually, the more I stare at that, that is kind of a cool color combo, huh? Anyway, I expand and oops, this looks strange. All right. So what do we want for borders on mobile? I am going to say my list items, which are where the borders are, we will give a border bottom of none, and that will erase that. I am going to say border right. Stick with the bright red for now, just to make that obvious. Cool. Red border over here, red border over here, red border over here. You might ask, do I want this red border on the edge? And I'm going to say yes, because at some point I'm going to want to set a max width for this container. I most definitely do not want my page growing to 1690 pixels wide, because look at this text. Nobody wants to read that. All right. So I'm going to add a left border, and we'll do that just by putting it on the UL itself. Border left, 1 pixel solid, FOO. Cool. And I'm just going to leave those red for now. You know, you can make them more subtle if you want, but hey, now they're kind of obvious, right? Okay. How wide is too wide? Well, again, that's the other breakpoint question. You might go, oh, maybe this is tablet view and I'm at 820 pixels and this looks pretty cool. And then, whoops, now I'm at 1200 pixels and, oh no, this is too wide. Well, at some point, we're going to want to set the ability to have a max width. And I'm going to do that with another media query. Like I said earlier, just pick what you think looks good. I might go media screen and min width 1024 pixels, just as an example. So when my screen reaches 1024 pixels, I don't want this to expand anymore. I'm going to say max width 1024 pixels. And hopefully most of you know the trick with margins, where if I say margin, 0 auto, my box becomes centered. All right, no margin on the top and bottom, automatically keep the same amount on the sides. And this max width prevents my content from getting too large. Okay, very nice. We are at mobile at 5, what do we say, 80. Now we have a horizontal navigation at 1024. Okay, no dramatic change, but my content simply stopped growing, so my text doesn't get too wide. Now, speaking of text that's not too wide, I actually do think my text is too wide. You'll often read recommendations like maybe like 80 characters a line or something. Don't give people body copy that's too wide. Well, this potentially depends on your layout, right? Like, do I have a second column, something like that? But in my case, I'm going to solve this using fluid typography. And you can see, oops. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, I have the same tab open multiple times. Here we go. This is the original place where I solved this. And you can see that I started at 20 pixels, I believe we could inspect and find out. And I actually made my text grow larger to fill the space. Okay, so we are going to take a look at CSS Tricks, has an awesome lesson on this. There's a little part of it that's a little tricky. CSS Fluid Typography. Okay. And all right, we are going to start with our initial font size declaration. Let me zoom in so you can read that a little better. They say 16 pixels. 16 pixels is, unless you're talking about like tiny copy like the footer or something, you generally don't want to go below 16 pixels ever on a mobile device. You're just going to make your copy too hard to read. I'm going to go larger than that, actually. I am going to start at 20 pixels. Oops, that is... Okay. And my text indeed got a little bigger because I went from 16 to 20. My headings are all relative, so they grew with it as well. I got a question about, will this be as a video after the stream? I can definitely answer that yes, it will still be on YouTube. I'm not really an expert on the other methods that we have out there. My colleague Karen is actually monitoring the chat. I don't know if she knows the answer, but definitely you'll be able to see the whole lesson on YouTube after and scrub backwards if you missed a part, that kind of thing. All right, so where was I? YouTube thumbs up. So yep, it will be on YouTube, and that's actually great because I was in a meeting during Gil's presentation that I mentioned earlier this week, but caught it later on YouTube and learned a lot. Okay, back to the question of fluid typography. I'm going to start a media query. Oops, there's my comment. I love to do this while I'm teaching. Throw links in like, oh, what was that thing that you covered? What was that article on CSS tricks or MDN? Oh, great, it's there at a comment. They have a media query written for 320 pixels, which is, as I've mentioned, probably the smallest mobile screen you'll ever see. They are saying, HTML, let's change that font size. We are going to use calc, which is a pretty cool CSS property that basically means make a calculation. Whatever you find in the parentheses, do that as a math formula. All right? So 16 pixels, I don't want to start with 16 pixels. To do this right, you really need to know what is your minimum and maximum. Variables would likely help here. Remember I mentioned Gil's lesson on variables, because that way if you change the minimum and maximum, you could probably just change the variable, right? Maybe we'll tweak this lesson later and add a variable. Because it's a little annoying right now. Like if I go, 20 is too big, I want to go 18. I do have two places to change it, up top and right here in this formula. You know, not that efficient. DRY, don't repeat yourself, right? So perhaps in a future lesson, we'll change that to a variable. Like I said, it helps to know what my maximum font size is going to be, and that's going to be at 1024. I am going to make my font size be 28 pixels. Again, you can fool with this, but as somebody who designs for mobile a lot, I really like large type. I have no problem with erring on the side of, yeah, let's make this font pretty sizable, right? I stare at the computer screen all day. I appreciate not having to squint at the text that I'm reading. All right. So if 20 is our minimum, 8 is our maximum, then there's some numbers here that we can fool with. It's basically we are going to start with 20, add 8 times, and then there's a little math formula here. It's basically VW is viewport width, 100% of the screen width, minus our minimum divided by, we'll have to handle this in a moment. This number, 680, is actually, why can't I deselect? That's actually the difference between our minimum and maximum. So basically 320, 1024, what's the difference? 704. All right. So if my screen happens to be 320, then, all right, 320 minus 320 is 0, divided by 704. That's still 0 times 8, still 0. So basically, we get 20 pixel font. And from there, it will use this calculation to scale up until eventually it gets to 1024 minus 320 divided by 704. Well, that would be 704 divided by 704, which is 1 times 8. I'm not a math teacher, so if I explain that too quickly, apologies for that. But 20 plus 8, we get our maximum of 28 pixels. And otherwise, it will be somewhere in between. I see a question that says, want to see an output. Not entirely sure if that means displaying it in the browser, which is our last step for today. So now we have, oops. Oh, I was grabbing the wrong part of the screen. There we go, 320 pixels. Let me inspect that. I don't know, where's, all right. I don't know how to best demonstrate where the calculation is being made. I should have dug into this part probably before I start this lesson. But anyway, what's going on is my calculation is happening. I'm at 20 pixels now. My font is growing larger. Yeah, here's where the calculation is being made, but it's being X'd out. I'd have to dig into why that's happening. But either way, it's working, right? My text goes up and up until it reaches 28 pixels. If you want to fool with those numbers a little, you could. What if I wanted 38 pixel font at my largest? Well, looks a little too crazy. I think that's a little bit too large, but it certainly works. My font shrinks all the way down to 20 pixels, goes all the way up to 38 pixels. Okay. Let me undo that. All right, cool. Yeah, this will be on YouTube. I will push this file up to GitHub just as soon as I sign off here. Once again, I want to thank everybody so much for joining me today. I hope this was helpful. You know, if there are questions, don't hesitate to post them. If you're a Treehouse student already, then you can use the front-end web design channels to ask questions, something that I didn't cover today. I'd love to make this lesson more exciting, drop in some images in a future lesson. And that's it. Thank you all so much for being here. Stay healthy, stay safe, and see you next time.